Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me is my partner in all things therapeutic, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
I am good. It's bittersweet today because we come to the end of the academic year. It's our last podcast for this UK academic year, so we are celebrating what has come and what we've done over the last year, but I guess also saying goodbye to some students who are graduating, moving on, going into their careers as counsellors, which is exciting, but we're sad to see you go.
Yeah, and what a fantastic journey. And we hope that we've been of service on your journey, and keep in touch. It's always good, as former tutors, it's always good to keep in touch with former students, catch up, see where they're going in their careers. So if you are graduating this year, congratulations. If you're progressing, well, stick with us, because we're going to be there right by your side, helping you with all those tricky bits of theory and making sense of some of the more heavy duty ideas in counselling and psychotherapy.
Like it. And nothing, I guess, is more heavy duty, and when I say heavy duty, I mean weighty, than the ethics that we follow as counsellors and as psychotherapists, which leads beautifully into today's episode, which is a special episode because we bring this episode to you at a time when there is a change coming to the ethical framework put out by the BACP. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Rory?
Well, yes. On the 1st of July 2018, the BACP will launch a new ethical code. And we've been very fortunate. The BACP have reached out to us, and I've conducted an interview with Professor Tim Bond, one of the architects of the BACP ethical framework. And he talked about the changes, and some really interesting things came up, so stay tuned in. And it really makes me think why we have ethics, Ken. And the reason we have ethics is because if we didn't have ethics, we may fall into patterns of kinship behaviour, where right and wrong is generated by our families or those close to us or groups, or kind of tribal behaviour, which I guess is groups. And also it can become quite animalistic. So ethics is about having a consensus of opinion that we can all agree to, and it's all very, very clear, and it helps us offer a standard of service no matter where we are in the country. And in fact, people adopt the BACP Code of Ethics in other parts of the world. Our friends listening, hi to you in Australia, the Antipodes, New Zealand, India is a big part of the world where counselling is going, and they're adopting the BACP ethical framework. So, yeah, it's a worldwide thing. And one of the interesting things that I found out on my researches is that the BACP codes of ethics are around virtue ethics, the idea of being a good person, being virtuous, doing the right thing. It's not just about right and wrong. It's about acting in a way where you try and do the best for whoever you're working with. And those are called virtue ethics. They come from Socrates. Believe it or not, the Greek philosopher Socrates.
Wow. Well, the thing with the ethical framework is that whether we are students of counselling, whether we've graduated and we're out there offering therapeutic services, is something that we need to look at again and again. As students, we look at it again and again because we're often asked in our assignments to write about an ethical framework, to compare, contrast different ethical frameworks. So I think a topical episode as we kind of come to the end of this academic year. So let's go straight into that interview with Professor Tim Bond.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Tim Bond. Thank you so much, Tim, for agreeing to come onto the podcast.
I'm delighted to have the chance to do so. It's a pleasure to talk about ethics and counselling.
Yes, indeed. And the reason you're here today is to talk about the new incantation of the BACP ethical framework. It was updated in 2016. It's due to be re-updated in 2018, or the new framework comes into place in the 1st of July 2018. So I guess my first question is, what prompted the revision of the framework after the last revision 2 years ago?
That's right. And I mean, the reason for doing it is twofold, really. First of all, we think of the ethical framework as a living document, and we live in rapidly changing circumstances, and the profession's changing quickly, so we need to revisit it fairly more frequently than perhaps we've been used to. But the other main reason for doing this is that for the last edition, we introduced a section called Our Commitments to Our Clients. And that was a bold experiment. We didn't know whether that would work. It emerged from discussions we had on webinars where we were thinking about a section of duties rather like the statutory services have. But for all sorts of reasons, we thought that wasn't quite the right approach to take in terms of counsellors and the importance of us being present with our clients, both personally and ethically. So that's why we chose to express our ethics as a set of commitments, which we express individually and also collectively as members of BACP.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because unlike maybe other professions, the essence of the personal relationship within counselling is really, really essential. So to have those commitments outlined, I think is really, really helpful.
Well, it changes the way we relate to our ethics. It's not something that's imposed on us. It's something that we develop in discussion with each other as members of BACP. And of course, that's become a much more complicated process now that BACP has so many members. So we did a number of things. First of all, we looked at the annual monitoring reports from the accredited courses, and that's the first time we've ever analysed those, and that made a big difference. We realised that trainers and trainees are much more important in our ethical environment than we'd previously appreciated, and particularly trainees make heavy use of the ethical framework. And again, computerisation is showing us who uses different documents provided by BACP and so on. So we don't necessarily know the individuals, but we can see the patterns of use.
Yes.
And then we did other things. We sort of analysed all the queries from clients and from practitioners to see what issues were coming up. We were aware there's a changing regulatory environment. We'll probably say more about that later, that we needed to address to bring the ethical framework up to date. And also we surveyed members, and we had about 1,400 responses, some of which were very carefully argued. There were very full responses explaining usually why they wanted something in, but there were a few areas where people said, we're not sure that the ethical framework's quite right, can we change it?
So it seems to me that this has been driven by listening to the membership, listening to the accredited course providers and getting feedback from the grassroots at training level, as well as queries from clients. It seems like a very collegiate exercise.
Well, if you decide that ethics is actually a community activity, that's the way to do it.
Absolutely. Yes.
Imperfect as it may be, it's a human endeavour, so very seldom are things absolutely perfect when we do it. But we're committed to trying to do that every 2 or 3 years, both as a means of updating, but also to check whether we are getting the voice right for members.
I heard you talk about the different regulatory environments. So one of the questions that came from our Facebook group, we asked our Facebook group to pose questions to you, is the revision of the framework paving the way for regulation?
No, not that I know of. At the moment, we are regulated by the Professional Standards Authority, same as the Health Service and Social Care and various other bodies. But the form of regulation we have is called the Voluntary Accredited Register. So basically that works by the Professional Standards Authority accrediting various bodies to form a register of their practitioners. It's a sort of halfway house between no regulation and statutory regulation, where you can't practice without falling within those registers. So in a way, it acts as a quality assurance stamp to the members of the public.
Yes, and that's something that's displayed. Certainly my stamp is displayed on my website, and all my credentials, and I know my colleagues are the same. And I do think that the general public are becoming more aware and more educated about the quality standards within counselling. One of the things that gets asked a lot is, why is it an ethical framework rather than a code or set of rules for counselling practice?
Well, we've chosen to present it as an ethical framework because there's such a range of different settings, different client groups that our membership work with, as well as the roles that people take on. So what we thought, we've tried to think of it as conceptually as something like a framework, or if you want a visual image, a scaffolding outside a building where you have different platforms, different ladders, different routes. So people doing different jobs can find their place in the framework. That makes it much harder to write, of course, because I often can't write a very simple statement without having to qualify it, so it applies to a range of settings.
I'm sure it does. When I think of a framework or scaffolding, if you're inside it, you're usually pretty safe. It's when people decide to go outside the scaffolding that disaster happens, and it's usually levelled, isn't it? There's different levels. Yeah. What are the main changes to the ethical framework?
Well, there are quite a lot of small ones. I'm not going to talk about those now. I'm just going to pull out the key ones. So one is that in the commitments, we realised that we hadn't committed ourselves to providing a standard of service to clients. So that now appears in the first part of the commitment statement. We've also ensured that the commitments can be printed on a single page of A4 to give to clients or colleagues or in agency settings to display, or whatever people want to do, because in some ways that is the most important part of the ethical framework. Everything else is in a way putting flesh or giving more detail to the commitment section. Then the other changes are there are new sections. So there's a section on breaks and endings, because we discovered that as part of the survey and analysis that clients were sometimes being very distressed by sudden endings, perhaps sometimes being referred to somebody else because the practitioner thought the client was not appropriate for their skill set, and how that's managed needs to be managed carefully. But also there have been a number of people who wrote to us about what happened if a practitioner suddenly became ill or died. And some were not hearing anything. Others were being contacted by very distressed family members.
Oh, great.
Others, and clearly very disruptive for clients, very difficult for people affected by somebody suddenly becoming ill or dying. So we need to give some thought to that.
Yes, and of course, trainees work in agencies, but independent practitioners work independently, isn't it?
And that's where the difficulties arise largely. Agencies are able to cover that. Other new sections, there's one on confidentiality, because the accredited course survey showed that trainees wanted more detail on confidentiality. Also, there's been regulatory changes in terms of GDPR, which is very much in the news as we speak. So we need to bring that up to date. Also working with colleagues and teams. We've taken that out from earlier, it's been in earlier editions, taken it out. But again, the courses were saying, actually, that was really helpful for trainees going off on placement and so on. So we've updated it and included it. And of course, the glossary's been updated. And the thing I would say to anyone trying to find their way around the ethical framework, the glossary also acts as an index. So if you look up a term glossary, you'll find it's listed everywhere. That term is then listed as every place it appears in the framework.
Yes, and also I hear that there's this section that you can print out to hand to clients, which gives an overview of the framework. That's going to be incredibly useful instead of just handing over the entire document.
The whole document is not really, and if a client wants it, absolutely,
yes,
it's available to them, they should have it and so on. But for most people, it's too long a document. whereas the commitment section actually acts as the summary of the whole framework.
Yes, so that's really useful to know.
Yeah.
What do you think the impact on trainees will be with the changes in the ethical framework?
Well, I think the key, there's a new section for trainees. I didn't list that on my new sections, but there is a new section for trainees. And that very much emerged from a combination of things, but particularly the feedback from courses. And so what we tried to do is to protect the trainees' opportunity to experiment, make mistakes, learn, and be fairly they apply their learning when they're on courses. So we just ask that trainees are respectful and supportive of each other's learning. But the other area we have to consider carefully, and there's legal aspects to this as well as ethical aspects of it, about the level of the standard of service a trainee is expected to provide to members of the public when they start their practice. And that's actually basically the same standard as would be expected of any other practitioner. So what we've said there is that the trainee is expected to achieve that standard, but can do so with the support of other people. So particularly the trainer, the placement provider, and the supervisor would be obvious members. We've created an ethical responsibility for them to collaborate with each other, providing that, but also for the trainee to be open and honest with them.
Yes, and that leads me nicely into the next question, Tim. One of the things that comes up a lot, certainly on our Facebook page, is informing clients that a trainee is a trainee. Why is it considered good ethical practice to do that?
It's in the interest of openness and honesty, so that at any stage in our career, from trainee to many years down the road, we should be open and honest with our clients about what our background is and suitability for providing that service. And of course, I know some trainees, and I experienced it myself when I was a trainee some years ago, sometimes feel uncomfortable about saying I'm a trainee. Now, we've not required that the trainee always tells the client themselves. It may be if their clients go through some pre-assessment or assessment interviews, that would be the point it would be discussed. So it might not be discussed directly with the trainee. But if that hasn't taken place, then it would fall to the trainee. And my recommendation to people is, if they find themselves in a situation, they explain the benefits of being a trainee. You're never more alert, more vigilant. You're never better supported.
Yes, and in terms of trainees, they have a shorter supervision ratio. In other words, they have more supervision. They're in class. They're with their tutors. They're with their peers.
Exactly.
And they're right on the arc of their learning. Even in terms of applying the theory, they're right on the arc of it, aren't they? So important.
Yes. Yeah. No. I mean, if I'm looking for a therapist, I might well go to a trainee, because you never get someone who's more attentive.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it, that maybe, and I'm not saying it's the case for everybody, but as people move through the arc of their practice career, they move farther away from that sort of rich environment of training, because they're literally immersed in it.
Yes. I think the other thing that happens is we become more experienced. There are some strengths from that, but we lose sight of what it's like sitting in the client's chair. The trainee is much closer to that experience in most situations, because they're also usually having or have recently had therapy themselves.
Yes, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of trainees out there who would wholeheartedly agree with that. It's so good to hear the value that trainees bring. I think that sometimes that's not kind of voiced enough. What are the ethics of trainees being paid for working with clients in a similar way to, say, doctors or nurses are paid at the beginning of their careers?
Well, there's no ethical reason why trainees shouldn't be paid. So it's historical that our services haven't quite developed in those ways. And indeed, I suspect the fact that a lot of trainees aren't paid is probably the difficulty in finding placements, and that might be another barrier to trainees finding placements. But there's no reason why we couldn't and shouldn't set up services which could attract enough income to be able to pay trainees probably a fairly modest fee for their work, but nonetheless something for that work.
Yes, or cover their supervision costs maybe, or something.
Whatever,
like that.
indeed, yes.
Yes. Now, in the new framework, there's a note on changing on notes. So, what has the approach to keeping notes change? And I don't like doing two questions, but what does keeping notes that are adequate, relevant, and limited mean in actual practice?
Okay. Now, the language is the language of GDPR. So that's what GDPR requires of all records by any professional or for any professional purposes. So adequate means appropriate for the purpose. And in the way in which GDPR works, purpose is really important. So adequate is appropriate to the purpose. I'm just trying to see if I can see what the other words were at the moment. Remind me of them again.
Yes,
Laura?
they're adequate, relevant, and limited.
Right. So relevant means that it relates to the work that's taking place with the client. So let me give you an absurd example. If the client starts talking about a particular cat or dog breed you're interested in, but it isn't directly relevant to the therapy, you wouldn't include that.
No,
okay.
Yes.
But you would include what it told you about the client's mental state.
Yes.
And the last one was?
Well, the last one was limited, relevant and limited.
Limited. So there's a concern that the records shouldn't be over full, that they should be limited to what serves the purpose.
Yes.
Of those records.
Yeah, so they need to be factual. They need to contain facts. Would a therapist put in maybe an aid to memory about what they might want to bring up in the next session? If
Certainly, and this doesn't exclude process notes, and it doesn't mean we all have to write our notes in the same way. And indeed, if you work for several agencies, you may find they have different requirements, and you have to learn different styles for different agencies. So for some, it's the difference between when we're doing training, very often we write fuller accounts for case studies or process analysis and so on. But at the working notes in life in practice tend to be much shorter, much crisper, much more fact orientated, and aids to memory, and might well include something about watch for this, or maybe raise this in the next session, or and may well include some process notes of your own.
And yes, and that brings me on to another question. Can a client ask to see a process notes?
Right. Yes, they can. I think probably the more important question is, do you need to show them to them?
Well, yes.
So the and the answer to that is, you don't need to show the client anything in which they are not identifiable by themselves or by other people who might know information about them. So this leads to two types of practice with regard to process notes. Some people, particularly within the person-centered tradition, have taken the courageous stance that the process notes are integral to their work, and they will include them within the client record. And if a client wants to see the notes, they can see the whole record, including the process notes, and the practitioner will explain them to them. And some person-centered counsellors have even gone further than that. And when they've been called to court as a witness and been asked to provide their records, they've provided the full record with the process notes included. And that's worked if they can explain what the function of the process notes are. The other approach is to say, no, we keep the client records very factual, very client-focused, and our process notes tend to be kept as a separate sort of more journal item, which might be used in supervision or for other purposes. Sorry, that's a dog shaking its head.
It's all right.
Just to explain the noise.
Yes, yes.
It'll settle down again soon. What happens is that people are very careful not to include the identity of the client or any detail about the client.
That's the key thing, isn't it? That if you're keeping process notes, they may be just for your own process, and if the client's not identifiable, then it might not form part of the record because they can't be identified.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the questions that comes up is, how can I use the ethical framework to help me build relationships with clients, especially when starting my practice?
Okay, well, there are several things there. First of all, there's quite a lot in the ethical framework about being trustworthy and building a relationship of trust and the boundaries in the relationship. All that's relevant. But one of the main things I would recommend for people is when you have your first discussions with clients, particularly clients who've never had counselling or any of the related roles before, related services before, is helping them to think through what it is they want to know and what their concerns are. And I might give them the A4 sheet of commitments and just give them an opportunity to look through it and give them an opportunity to ask me questions about what's there. And that gives the practitioner a clue as to where the client's concerns are.
Yes.
So it just helps to forge the relationship.
Yes, it starts the relationship off on a very collegial, power equalizing basis, doesn't it? Where the client has a voice. Yeah.
And we lose sight of how powerless people feel when they're seeking help.
Yes.
And so taking those concerns seriously and their sense of vulnerability seriously already starts to build a relationship and give it a good foundation.
And empowers the client, yes. So the last question is, what does the BACP do to support my practice and promote counselling as a profession?
Right. Well, BACP does quite a lot in terms of, it ranges from talking to government bodies trying to secure funding for counselling, talking to voluntary agencies trying to promote counselling. It provides, it does quite a lot of research and supports research, because any professional without an evidence base nowadays finds it much, much harder to find its place in modern services. The journal is a really important source of communication and insight, but that's also supplemented in the context of the ethical framework. We have good practice and action resources which address in more detail than is possible in the ethical framework various issues from contracting, online working, confidentiality, record keeping, and so on. So there's a big range of things there, but above all, I think BACP helps us to have a forum in which we can share our experiences and also build a network. So just last week I was at a Making Connections event. This one was at Nottingham, and that was good. I found it very helpful. It was a really good updating session on the consequences of how to work with clients who've been raped and various sexual attitudes to rape and sexual assault, which I found very thought-provoking and led me to start to rethink some of my practice. But also there were opportunities to meet other people working in the same area. So,
yeah, the couple of things that occur to me there, Tim, is the first thing is that the ethical framework, people should be reading it and availing themselves of it, but also make sure that you avail yourself of all the other resources that are in the BAC, the help sheets and the good practice guides all that type of thing. There's a lot more than just the ethical framework.
No, the ethical framework's free to everybody, member or not, but everything else, I'm afraid, is behind a paywall.
It is. Yeah.
But I do recommend them.
Yes, they're really useful, and I know a lot of tutors use them as support for teaching.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Bond, it's been a real pleasure interviewing you and hearing about the new BACP ethical framework. It's available from the BACP website now. It goes live on the 1st of July 2018. And finally, Tim Bond, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And also, if you're a member of BACP and you have any views on the new framework, please take every opportunity to email them to bacp@bacp.co.uk. It really helps us because it's a living document. We will be analysing all responses over the next few years in order to inform the next edition.
So if you're a member, your voice counts.
It does. Thank you very much, Rory.
Thank you.
Thank you, as always, Rory, and a special thank you to Professor Tim Bond. Really, really informative. Certainly opened my eyes. And of course, remember, as always, there is a download that Rory has prepared for you, and that is 5 key points that relate to the ethical framework. And you can get that by just going to our show notes page. And where will you find that? Go to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. That will give you all the archives of all of our podcasts. You want to navigate your way to episode 83. That's today's episode. All of the show notes you will find right there on that page with links to the BACP and the new ethical framework. And from within that page, you will be able to download Rory's super duper handout, 5 key points relating to the ethical framework.
Yes, it was a really good interview. As I'd say, I'd echo your sentiment, Ken. We thank Professor Tim Bond for taking the time. It was a fascinating interview, and I got a lot out of it. You know, to hear one of the people who've actually written or contributed to the ethical framework is marvelous, and I'm sure that those people who are listening will maybe see the ethical framework maybe differently. I hope that's the case, you know, see it from a different perspective.
Indeed. So as we come to the end of episode 83, I would like to personally thank each and every one of you for your ears, for listening, for tuning in, for giving us over 500,000 downloads to the Counselling Tutor podcast episodes. We really appreciate you. We appreciate you being part of this because, as I say, from time to time, without you, it would just be Rory and I sitting having a bit of a ramble.
Yes, chatting counselling topics over a cup of tea. Yeah, we're really grateful. We see the podcast stats, and we're just so grateful that people just take the time out of the day to listen to me and Ken chunder on about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And if you are finishing your studies for the year, have a super break. If you're going to be continuing next year, I want to continue on the journey with us. We look forward to seeing you when we start again in September. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.